ersten inhaltlichen Beitrag zu starten. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass wir für den Eröffnungsvortrag Haluk Soydan gewinnen konnten. Haluk Soydan ist Professor an der School of Social Work der University of Southern California in Los Angeles und gegenwärtig Direktor des Hemorrhage Center for Science in the Human Services. Er hat insbesondere zur Ideengeschichte der sozialen Arbeit gearbeitet und einen kritischen und analytischen Blick auf die Evidenzbasierung geworfen. In seinen neuesten Arbeiten führte er diese Stränge in seinen Betrachtungen der Entwicklung der Science of Social Work zusammen. Er kommt aus Schweden, ist nun seit längerem in den USA und auch in China tätig. In Schweden hatte er Professuren für soziale Arbeit an den Universitäten Göteborg, Stockholm und Örebro inne und war über 10 Jahre Forschungsdirektor am Institute for Evidence-Based Social Work Practice des Nationalen Amtes für Gesundheit und Wohlfahrt in Schweden. Haluk Soydan hat sehr viele in unterschiedliche Sprachen übersetzte Veröffentlichungen. Einzelne von ihnen wurden mit Preisen versehen und ist in vielen verschiedenen Funktionen aktiv. Zur DGSA gibt es langjährige Verbindungen. Beispielsweise ist er bereits vor 20 Jahren auf einem Podium im Rahmen des Locus in Wiesbaden und Mainz mit Ernst Engelke und Silvia Stauber-Nasconi aufgetreten und seine Arbeiten wurden immer wieder in den Sektionen der DGSA diskutiert. Wie schon angesprochen, wird wegen der Zeitdifferenz zwischen uns und ihm seine Keynote als Film eingespielt und ich freue mich sehr auf seinen heutigen Beitrag mit dem Titel In Pursuit of a Locus for Social Work in the Realm of Science und sage Film ab.
Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm very pleased this morning to be able to participate in this conference. In fact, this is the second time I have the privilege of addressing a national German conference, the previous being the annual conference of Bundeskongress Soziale Arbeit, just about 20 years ago in Mainz. This time, this will be virtual communication. Nevertheless, an important one. My gratitude goes to the conference organizers for providing an opportunity to address this distinguished conference. I'm aware of the long-standing interest in and contributions to the core issues of social work science by German scholarship. I have always found it stimulating to contrast perspectives as across the nations and scientific traditions. German scholarship has always been a stimulating tradition to deal with. Some of my historical philosophical stands have been in alignment with understanding of German scholars, while my other stands, such as my dedication to evidence-based treatments, has been met with skepticism. In pursuit of scientific advancement, I find this exchange of views very stimulating. Today, I will be elaborating on 2 issues. First, the genesis of social work as a professional practice and scientific activity based on Western history of ideas and philosophy of science. 2, an overview of recent developments in the United States, as I was asked by the conference organizers. This includes 2 different developments. The first one, it is the advance of evidence-based practice and its supporting methodology. And the second is about efforts to find a home for social work science in scientific realism, which is an approach to science and philosophy of science. This approach has its origins at my own School of Social Work at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. At this point, I would like to start with a few words on the notion of science. John Zeeman, a New Zealander and British theoretical physicist, defined the ultimate purpose of science as solving problems. In his remarkable book, Real Science, What It Is and What It Means from 2000, he places science in a complexity of value systems and politics by making clear its social character. Science, he writes, quote, involves large numbers of specific people regularly performing specific actions, which are consciously coordinated into larger schemes. Although research scientists often have a great deal of freedom in what they do and how they do it, their individual thoughts and actions only have scientific meaning in these larger schemes. End of quote. Paraphrasing Zeman, we could say that social work as a scientific discipline is somewhat similar to other institutions such as organized religion, law, and humanities in producing knowledge. Typically, knowledge is the principal purpose and the outcome of social work as scientific discipline. This certainly defines the locus of social work research in society, as well as impacts the type of knowledge it produces. As an institution, science endeavors recognition and legitimacy. To devise legitimacy, science as institution tries to strengthen itself with a number of supporting factors, including research for a locus in the historical development of social sciences, a platform in the history of science providing ontology, epistemology, and a methodology. I see social work as a professional practice and scientific discipline. This duality embraces at the same time professional tools for betterment of conditions for individuals, groups, and communities, scientific methods for conducting research for advancement of the profession, and establishing social work as a science. All these components are intertwined. They condition each other in a complex way. Development of social work is historically determined, which means it is shaped by the conditions of specific societies in specific times. In other words, formation and development of social work in German-speaking societies may differ from those for English-speaking societies, let alone those Mandarin-speaking or perhaps Urdu-speaking. This diversity, however, is also dependent on and framed by the development of modern science and research methods and conventions. In other words, social work as profession and scientific activity has dissimilarities and similarities across nations globally. Excuse me. At times, a starting point for studies of this kind has been the assumption that human beings are programmed for mutual help and entertain an innate propensity to provide help. When choosing this approach, the main focus is on social work as an informal exchange between human beings. The scientific dimension lacks primary relevance. Another starting point is to seek the historical roots of social work in traditions of thought and action in which social work is grounded in purposefully organized activity or scientific thinking. It is the latter that marks the origins of my journey. In this perspective, social work practice to help those in need, to change people's conditions of life for the better, is connected to the scientific analysis in a given historical context. From the point of view of history of ideas in the West, this is generated by two historical events. One, the emergence of scientific analysis of society during the second half of the 18th century. And two, the application of scientific social analysis and prognosis as instruments of action for social change. I find roots of and scientific basis for social work on those thinkers who first developed scientific social analysis. I also find here the idea of spirit of human progress, which is of importance to social work as a practice and as a scientific activity. It's against this background and in my analysis of social work that it is claimed that social work consists in three components: practical activity, an academic discipline, and a research tradition. A study of traditions of thought and action that analyze society and that carry forward the work of change based on spirit of human progress and an innate propensity to offer aid reveals two tendencies that can be refined from the history of ideas. I call these tendencies in the evolution of history of ideas from theory to from theory to practice and from practice to theory. Shortly, I will come back to these notions. A purposeful and planned action for social change aims at altering what is regarded as undesirable and a social problem. A central issue in traditions of thought and action is whether people or society constitutes the basis of social problems. Historically, the term sick was attributed to individuals or society to locate dysfunctional or undesirable conditions. In the context of searching for social work's roots in the evolution of social sciences, the question of its relationship to other disciplines and activities arises. In my published studies, I discuss social work's historical relationship to the discipline of sociology as an illustration of the need for social work to define its own territory of inquiry. These two subjects have at least 2 points of intersection. The first is their interest in the study of social problems, and the second is their interest in social change and action for change. In contemporary discourse, similar intersections may be observed in relation to other disciplines and professional practices, such as nursing, psychology, psychiatry, social development, etc. In my earlier work, I present a theoretical frame of reference based on historical empirical data on the development of social science and how societies perceived and defined the locus of social problems. In my view, such a frame of reference helps us first to study and contextualize classical thinkers and practitioners so as to examine differences and similarities between them. Two, to explore ideas and human agency leading up to modern thinking in social work. And three, to justify why certain thinkers and activists can be claimed as classics of social work. I call this perspective bottom up, because it maps thoughts, events, and activities that have already historically taken place. It is nothing that we artificially attribute to social work. It is the history of social work as configured in the West. It's a common belief that the emergence of social work analysis, social analysis is attributed to Enlightenment, and the French Enlightenment philosophers are giving a central role in this process of change. The scientific or sociological analysis of society underwent a revolutionary transformation through the work of Scottish School, with Adam Smith and others as driving factors. Their work is based on the so-called four-stage theory and embraces four assumptions. First, society is a system in which the various components of society are dependent on each other. These different components are linked by horizontal relationships whose interconnected changes constitute what we call history. Second, the dynamics of society are independent of intentions of individuals. The collective activities of individuals form the basis of societal development. Third, society has grown at the cost of the individual. This relationship between the individual and society has meant that the individual has become increasingly civilized and is more legally secure, but individuals have also become more dependent on society and imprinted with social factors. Fourth, despite the fact that societal development is unplanned, with no goal or end, society shows a large number of patterns that can be discovered by the scientists. Thus, the Scottish School played an important role in originating the foundations of modern social science. They carried out an analysis of history and explained the mechanisms of change in society. Consequently, they laid the foundations of action for social change that is based on scientific analysis. But they did not make any purposeful predictions about future changes in society. It will be some time before these theories of society were linked to action for social change. The history of ideas in the 19th century was rooted in the 18th century scientific analysis of society and developed the central theme that sick or dysfunctional social conditions should be changed by means of scientific models and theories. In this sense, developments during the 19th century are of central importance to social work. So, coming back to my earlier reference, by theory to practice, I mean that research results and theoretical knowledge are intended as a foundation for social practice, regardless of whether the research is based on current professional and sociopolitical priorities or merely on issues raised theoretically, that is, intra-scientifically. From practice theory, on the other hand, I mean that social practice conducted by individuals may generate findings and repeated insights that may be distilled to generalized knowledge. For instance, much similar to practice-based research, a term used in the current social work discourse. In 19th century ideas of significance to the development of social work, these two tendencies exist side by side and to a certain extent are interwoven. This is because the traditions that develop as practice and which then attempt to form a theoretical foundation are influenced by theories of other traditions. Action for social change, seen from the viewpoint of the from theory to practice tendency in the history of ideas can be studied in both its narrow and wide meaning. The former refers to research explicitly formulated in such a way that its purpose is implementation for change. We can call this research for change. The latter refers to general social analysis and social theory used by a group of agents in order to change society. A more planned and systematically organized forms of research for change are found in post-World War II efforts in the West with the aim of betterment of social conditions for larger masses of national populations. Nowadays, the strongest current expression of research for change is perhaps the development of outcome studies and intervention research. As for the research for agent activity, we need to go back to the 19th century when several movements in different countries emerged and claimed to be able to change and improve society through scientific knowledge. Verein für Sozialpolitik in Germany was one of those movements. So I have called the second tendency in the history of ideas from practice to theory, from practice to theory. In terms of process, the practice, that is the action for social change, is the primary step and forms the foundation of accumulation of knowledge. Within this tradition, social work manifests itself mainly as a practical activity, the goal of which is to help people and communities affected by social problems. Social work, seen from the perspective of from practice to theory in the history of ideas, has its roots in the development of industrialism. The rapid industrialization of Europe and America with urbanization, unemployment, shortage of decent housing, and other social problems as consequences triggered in people a desire to remedy what they considered problematic. At times, it was thought that society generated problems. Consequently, something must be done about the problem-generating social structures. But it was also thought that individual-generated social problems, and as a result, action strategies for change must be directed towards the problem-generating individual instead of society. Within the frame of the from practice to theory tendency, we find both of these concepts, which to some degree have developed in conflict with each other. Social work as a practical activity developed both in Europe and the United States. Developments in Britain provided impulses for developments in America, vice versa. In my own studies, I have specifically focused on two American pioneers of modern social work, namely Jane Addams and Mary Richmond, both connected to 1880s professional groups developed in the United States. Addams and her sympathizers settled in poor neighborhoods and lived side by side with the people they served. The basic view of the settlement movement was that environment, that is society, generated social problems, and that change must be made in people's surroundings if social workers were to improve the social situation of individuals and combat poverty. The settlement movement sought contacts with knowledge-producing institutions relatively early. There were personal contacts between Jane Addams and her colleagues and prominent researchers involved in social issues, people such as John Dewey. This context and the eagerness of settlement movement to establish a base for its practical social work in the production of knowledge led to founding of the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy, which in 1920 became the School of Social Service and Administration at the University of Chicago, one of the most prominent schools in this country. As the opposite, the Charity Organization Society, with Mary Richmond at the forefront, was not interested in social reforms. Their ideas were based on the assumption that individuals were the cause of poverty and social problems. Thus, Mary Richmond took a different attitude. In striving to establish a base for casework through professional schooling, she was against university-based courses. She believed that it would ruin the natural commitment of social workers to their work, and argued in favor of an independent school for training social workers. Through the Charity Organization Society in New York, the New York School of Philanthropy was established. It was later known as the New York School of Social Work and was incorporated into Columbia University in 1959, ultimately being designated as the Columbia University School of Social Work in the 1962-63 academic year. From the practice to theory tendency in the history of ideas in social work is a strong tradition. It is a tendency that first and foremost provides social work as practice with a historical identity. It also provides the profession with an identity. But that role does it play in relation, what role does it play in relation to social work as a research tradition? Has it worked as a driving force for research in social work? And so, if so, in what way? My hypothesis is that this tendency has had a significant impact on social work as research tradition. Of course, the hypothesis can only be substantiated by means of a description of the history of ideas of this tendency. So let's look at a theoretical frame of reference based on the historical development of social work now. Two central variables here of different aspects of social work are brought out in my talk today, and I dichotomize them. A word of warning first, though. The warning is at this juncture to remind us that modern social sciences and social work have already transformed themselves beyond this historical perspective. For instance, intervention research in social work typically involves from theory to practice and from practice to theory in the same context as an intertwined and interactive process in an unprecedented fashion. So here, as you see, dichotomized cross-tabulation of the variables, the development of the interaction between theory and practice in the history of ideas, and the variable, the nature of causes of social problems, produces a four-field table. This shows us that there are four main historical fields of social work core in two components. One is notions of social work theory, two, social work practice methods. In my previous work, this table illustrated substantial historical exemplifications of agent activity, structural social work, psychological approaches, and psychosocial work. Unfortunately, I don't have time to elaborate on details of those examples this morning, but they can be found in my published work. Now we are moving to the American social work. In many ways, United States is comparable to Europe, including size of population, cultural diversity, diversity of schools of thought and scientific orientations, etc. Consequently, a number of theoretical and empirical orientations are embraced and practiced in the field of social work research and adjacent sciences and professions. This morning, I will briefly touch on two developments. The first one is evidence-based practice, and the second one being shaping a science of social work into critical realism. Let's start with evidence-based practice. Advances in social work research during the past 2 decades, especially in the United States, and perhaps this is from a biased perspective, are unprecedented. In my view, the social work professions is a science and practice. Awareness of and efforts to associate itself with high quality scientific evidence is the core of this unprecedented development. Dedication to intervention research, outcomes research, systematic research reviews, methodology associated with meta-analytic analysis, comparative effectiveness research strategies, translational research, development of high-quality clearinghouses, and transdisciplinary team science collaborations is a token of the recognition of the importance of scientific knowledge in driving practice, as well as the crucial role of practice in guiding research. Origins of modern intervention research in social work and human services were shaped during the post-War II era in the United States. Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and to some extent President Nixon, launched nationwide programs to improve the conditions of the most needy and underserved cross-sections of the American population. These social reforms aim to induce the change, constitute an important backdrop to what later came to be defined as intervention research. The American psychologist and methodologist Donald Campbell coined the concept of experimenting society, meaning that the eradication of societal problems should be based on scientific principle of experimentation and evaluation of intervention outcomes. However, social work's professional and scientific advancement came into full blossom in the early 1990s in this country. The establishment of the Cochrane collaboration in 1993 and the Campbell collaboration in 2000 boosted the profession's efforts to further advance its scientific positions. The Cochrane and Campbell collaborations develop and disseminate high-quality systematic reviews of effectiveness studies of health, social work, and other behavioral and educational fields. The collaborations have been instrumental in developing a science of systematic research reviews and raising scientific bar for evidence used in action for change. After all, the foremost principle of any profession dedicated to improve the lives of others is not to harm. Although not yet proliferated to all levels of profession, there is currently an aspiration in many layers of the profession worldwide to strengthen its scientific base to advance its practice for the benefit of clients. It is the dedication of the profession to evidence-based interventions and programs. But what about the profession's dedication to evidence-based practice as a process of translating and implementing evidence-based interventions? Evidence-based practice is defined by its founders as an intervention of best evidence available, with client values and acceptance, as well as traditional and other structural circumstances. Elaborating on this question in detail is beyond the main purpose of my talk this morning. While a brief answer will be that the profession's dedication to evidence-based practice is currently unclear and ambivalent. One aspect of the issue seems pertinent to the context here. As I discussed elsewhere, knowledge is never 100%. In social work science, as in all science, what we call evidence, including the gold standard evidence, consists of estimates and approximations of our measurements of real life situations. Karl Popper famously emphasized, quote, "No matter how many instances of white swans we may have observed, this does not justify the conclusion that all swans are white." End of quote. So there's good reason to acknowledge that there are limits to scientific evidence. This limitation prompts caution when applying scientific evidence in action for change, an insight that urges social workers to dedicate themselves to evidence-based practice. National Institutes of Health, the main research funding organization of the federal government in the United States, has many years back embraced not only evidence-based medicine, but also, among other fields of practice, evidence-based social work is a priority for funding research projects. For example, NIH is the largest research funding organization that funds evidence-based social work practice from a client perspective. Experimental studies in social work, translation of generalized evidence to context-specific sites, etc. Because NIH funds long-term, multifaceted, and very large grants, a functional research infrastructure has been developed in a few but influential schools of social work in the country. NIH also funds training of junior researchers in the field of evidence-based social work. Now I'm moving to the second development in the United States, which is the attempt to anchor the science of social work in a realist science frame. At the 2011 annual conference of the Society of Social Work and Research, John Brecky, a researcher at the University of Southern California, called for establishing the science of social work on the basis of a well-established philosophical platform that goes as scientific realism and critical realism. Brecky's proposal has been followed up by a group of scholars in a series of roundtables at a place called Islandwood Center near Seattle. Later, some of the contributions were published in a book, shaping a science of social work. As many of you might be familiar with, scientific realism is a philosophy of science that postulates ontology, epistemology, and methodology. The ontological proposition suggests that the reality has a definite structure that's independent of human subjectivity. The epistemological understanding is that most established theories are as close as possible to the objective reality around us. And the methodology of scientific realism suggests that scientific theories may be true or false, but the reality they refer to is factual. Our understanding of the reality is oftentimes incomplete, but this does not mean that there are no other aspects of the reality to discover. Further, critical realism tries to place the philosophy of science, of scientific realism, in a social and historical context. It suggests that science is a human artifact and it takes place in a historical, social, cultural, political context. It concludes that science has a social dimension and an objective dimension. In other words, the mission of science is to map structures of objective, subject-independent reality. The realist frame gets more complicated by the introduction of transitive and intransitive aspects of science, the former referring to the products of scientific activities such as theories, and the latter to the objective structures of the reality independent of human subjectivity. Now, Breck and other researchers propose that social work as a science can and should be articulated within the frame of critical realism. I personally think that this proposition is legitimate as any other proposition about how social work as a science should be articulated. Critical realism, as well as the science of evidence-based practice, are top-down perspectives that we attribute to social work to define it as a science and create a unique identity for it. The strength of any approach to develop a science of social work will be depending on the explanative ability of the very approach, as well as its ability to solve practical problems of social work profession better and more efficient than competing approaches. The strength of the proposal to understand social work as a science within the frame of critical realism remains to be seen by the development of the research field in the future. Colleagues, to finalize my talk, I would like to wrap up with a recent personal experience that was triggered by the barbaric aggression of a country against a peaceful neighboring country. I have been an institutional member of a small, invitational international network that is now retired. A dear American colleague emailed all members recently and wrote, quote, "We remain a force for the advancement of social welfare across national boundaries, which is always what we represented. Now with Ukraine, what can I say? I struggle for a way to respond and I'm at loss. I reach out to my European friends to offer guidance. What can we do as a social welfare international actor? This is the time to act." End of quote. I spent a long time to think about this matter. I just couldn't come up with something substantial. In my response, I opted to develop a geopolitical analysis of the situation. But when it came to options of the profession of social work, I came short. And I wrote back, quote, "Sorry for not being able to offer something constructive for the group to undertake," end of quote. In the conversation, a Swiss colleague wrote, I quote, "We have to proclaim and defend the values of human rights. We have to struggle for social justice," end of quote. Another colleague from Finland wrote back, I quote, "But I have to say that it is rather difficult to find other ways of helping than supporting Ukrainians with donations," end of quote. A Norwegian said, quote, "Donations must be what they need most," end of quote. And an Italian colleague said, quote, "Sorry if I am not clear. I feel very confused myself," end of quote. So the conversation went on this way. So my conclusion is that social work profession stands impotent in the face of major aggression and human tragedy that we all witness happening in the heart of Europe. This impotency of the profession has long been my professional concern. How can social work as a profession be useful, functional, and efficient to solve social problems? This is the most important question of the profession in my view. And the path to safe, efficient, and ethical problem prevention and problem solution is the path of robust scientific platform and a helping profession. The pursuit of locus for social work in the realm of science is thus, in my view, intimately intertwined with the ability of the science to deliver safe, efficient, and ethical tools of prevention and change to the better. Thank you so much, colleagues, for listening this morning.